Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Sally Adnams Jones, and I'm a therapist and a psychoeducator. And I really would love to respond to what is happening in the New Age spiritual movement right now. There's a little shindig going on, and a New Age guru and an entrepreneur and someone who sells supplements has published a video about a new type of relationship that he thinks is evolutionary. So you can find that online. Aubrey Marcus shares his new vision of relationships, and he calls this radical monogamy. So you can find that online. And what I have found spectacular this last week is looking at all the other wonderful commentaries made about this particular conversation. So let me back up a little bit and say, before I start, who I am. I have absolutely no skin in this game. None at all. So I don't know Aubrey or Vylana or Alana. I have never met them. And for transparency, I should say, I do know Marc Gafni. So just to be brief, to get that out of the way, and to be upfront and locate my own narrative in my history, which we should all do for ethical reasons. I'm an ex-colleague of Marc Gafni's. I was on the board of one of his organizations. And the reason I'm no longer there is for all the reasons that have been cited in these beautiful videos that have been made outlining Gafni's past. So I don't need to go through that again. Just to say briefly, he himself does not have a great legacy around monogamy. And the only reason I'm commenting here, I was drawn to this because some of the women who have been abused by Gafni pointed out this new iteration of his ongoing conversation for decades around polyamory and how he's reframing it suddenly with some new words. So the women who have courageously spoken about Gafni's abuse, his relationships with underage girls and sexual assault because they were not consensual, apparently. That's the allegation. The numbers of women whose stories I hold about his abuse, ongoing sexual abuse around dark practices without consent, privacy issues, which are basically secrecy and lying. And in the last organization that I was involved in with him, there was polyamory practiced. And I think over his history, to be fair, maybe he's learning about ethical non-monogamy. So, for example, he would groom people, and I include myself in that. He would try to groom women involved in the organization. And then he would say to them, we can't go any further, pretending that those people were the only one, because there were bubbles of secrecy that he calls privacy containers. And then he would say to them, if you want to go further, for my safety, because I've had a smear campaign, you will need to sign a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA. So I was somebody that he groomed, pretended I was the only one. We were never involved sexually. This was done long distance digitally, which he does. And then I was invited to join a group sex practice. I am a tantrika. My own lineage is classical tantra. I was invited as an option to join a group sex practice, and I could choose anybody I wanted in the community to be there. I didn't know that everybody was involved in the sexual practices. And if I did choose that, I'd have to sign an NDA. So that's my history. Just to say, I did not sign that NDA. I think that's incredibly unethical. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this video, is the lack of ethics of self-proclaimed New Age gurus. So he felt if there's an NDA that you sign, that's ethical non-monogamy. And I felt that that is silencing of women who go on to experience very dark sexual practices and abuse, but they're not allowed to speak about it after because they've signed this document. So just to say, I am monogamous. I don't sign NDAs. That is a very dangerous practice for women because then you're silenced. You can never speak about the abuse. And I was curious that this group that I was serving on the board had these secret practices, cult-like group sex, by invitation and money only. You paid lots of money. They made you sign documents of secrecy, and then you can never speak about it again. So at that point, I questioned some of the other women in Gafni's organization. So many of them came forward, tears, and what I call moral injury. As a therapist, I'll call it moral injury. Pressure to do behaviors and incorporate others into those behaviors because of power structures. Moral injury. And a distinct lack of ethics, despite the claims of ethical non-monogamy, polyamory. So just to say that these women that I know extremely well and care for deeply, who had the courage to come forward and speak, got hold of me this week and said, please take a look. He's surfaced again. Gafni keeps being excommunicated from his groups for very unethical behaviors. And that's all online. These are not allegations. You can do your research. There are legal cases. Several groups have excommunicated him and expelled him. There are documents online saying why you should never have Gafni as a teacher and why. And there are very courageous documented stories by the women who have been abused. So none of this is me making allegations that are unfounded. That's all online. So when I discovered this, after a couple of years of being in the organization, feeling that my volunteer labor was being siphoned, my attention was being siphoned, my intellectual property and creativity was being siphoned and plagiarized. And now I hear, after I've been invited to do practices that I'm not in alignment with, I had a 30-year marriage that had ended. I am committed to what this community that we're speaking about today talks about, divine union. That is my practice. I'm a classical tantrika. So none of this was in alignment. And I don't have judgment around polyamory or non-monogamy if it's ethical. We're all consenting grown-ups. So I have no skin personally in this game. It was suggested by women whose stories I hold that I take a look at what's happening again, that this person, Gafni, starts communities, starts grooming people for money and orgasms. People start making complaints. He's then asked to leave. He's even being defrocked as a rabbi, and yet people still call him rabbi. He's not a rabbi. In fact, what I'm going to focus on in this talk is, and I'm going to call it spin doctors, people who claim to be counselors, therapists, guides, who have literally no training whatsoever to do that. Gafni has a PhD in some obscure Aramaic text. He's a philosopher. That does not allow you to jump disciplines and charge hundreds of dollars to become somebody's therapist, which he poses for with Marcus. He's a marriage guide or counselor here. Maybe as a rabbi, he got some training of that, but he's a proven track history of abusing that power and has been excommunicated from communities where he was a rabbi doing that for abuse of 5 or 6 women in Israel, for example. So you can look up his history. I don't really want to go into Gafni. That's not about him so much as, and I know that what he will say, because I know him well, is Sally has joined the smear campaign. Sally is lying. Sally is doing name rape, because that's the avoidance of any accountability that has historically happened with anybody that brings up conversation about his abuse and what some people have called his sexual addiction, that he frames as eros, that he is gifted with this kind of libidinal excess and charisma, and that people have it in for him because of this. So we're going to move from people to patterns. I want to look at patterns. I'm not here to assassinate Gafni's character. I left his organization years ago. I don't follow his work. In fact, he follows mine and plagiarizes it constantly, which he does. That's one of the complaints online from men, is he abuses women sexually and men for their IP or their money. So I have nothing to do with Gafni, so this is not personal. And I'm going to look at this conversation more from an ethics point of view, because I'm a therapist and a psychoeducator. And from cultish dynamics, because I have other material online about what I call spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is a thing and it's growing, and I'm deeply concerned about it. So I'm going to look at this as patterns, not about people. There's plenty online about the people online. You can find that. So I'd just like to back up a bit and say I was amazed at the incredible collective wisdom that has arisen this week from the conversations. I just found it so reinforcing that we are evolving as a community of spiritual practitioners. Every single person's video was amazingly accurate and very gratifying to listen to. I learned quite a bit from many people. I like to listen to all the voices first and then kind of make a summary and come in from a perspective that really hasn't been looked at. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered, because everything has been said, except for this ethics of grown men framing themselves as counselors when they're being abusive of their power. So I wanted to look more at that angle and contribute on that level, because as an educator working with young people, as a psycho-spiritual educator, my interest is in young people. And if you work for an institution like the university or a church, there are strict guidelines about student-teacher relationships. And if there's an operative who creates his own organization and has plants in the board that he has selected who don't give any guardrails and don't hold that person accountable, they can do whatever they want. And that is a growing phenomenon with these grifter gurus. And it's a dangerous cultish influencer phenomenon that is happening. So I just wanted to talk into that, about the power dynamics that I saw on Aubrey Marcus and Vylana and Alana's conversation with Gafni performing the role of therapist. And I want to just dissect what I saw with that kind of situation where somebody has hopped disciplines with no training whatsoever, breaches every kind of professional guardrail or ethics code, drops in his own product and platform because he's selling, really just using Marcus for his audience to leap up, because he's been excommunicated so many times. He keeps losing audiences and he keeps reappearing. It's quite the phenomenon. And just to say, he's used many people like this. He's used Barbara Marx Hubbard, he's used Ken Wilber, he's used lots and lots of people that perhaps should remain nameless. But those are the two that Sally Kempton, the Whole Foods guy. He uses people, attaches to them their money or their platform to create a supply of attention for himself. Attention, money, free labor, and of course, orgasms. So that vampire energy is what I want to look at. I'm no longer talking about anybody specific. It's a pattern. And that pattern was only named very mildly and occasionally in the videos and the conversation, but it's out there in other communities, which is the grandiose, cerebral, somatic narcissist and a group of codependents. So I want to look at that pattern that can apply to anybody. I'm not being specific here. It's mostly a cult dynamic conversation. And it always results in tears. And it's usually the women who are in tears. So that's what I'm interested in, is speaking up for student abuse, the gaslighting of women, male-dominated spiritual arenas where they articulate the curriculum or the belief system or the meme, whatever you want to call it, which favors men. And women can comply. They usually end up in tears. They're gaslighted to say you're not developed enough, you need to go do more shadow work unless you agree and comply and get on board. if you don't like it, you can leave. But then that just shows you're not very developed. Because the spiritual container is favoring the masculine, and it's not the healthy masculine, it's what I would call the toxic masculine or the wounded masculine, who is actually using this toxic feminine. So that's the toxic masculine, toxic feminine dynamic in a cult is huge. And it's usually a central male narcissist. Not always, there's women out there doing this too, who are in their masculine. So we know that that's a dynamic that's not correlated to sex. It's an energy. The toxic masculine in any human form, siphoning attention, labor, creative energy, and sexual energy from the toxic feminine. And it's about boundaries. It's a boundary issue. So the toxic masculine violates boundaries. They keep wanting to push more and more. They won't take no for an answer. They will gaslight if you have a boundary and or you undeveloped, shadow, whatever, because their libidinal agenda is unconscious and deeply in the shadow, which is to have no container within their own energy field. So they're impulse driven, their needs are subconscious, and always desire drives them unconsciously. And nothing is ever enough, actually. It's never enough for the empty, toxic masculine who keeps iterating more and more of whatever it is. Substance, more sex, more money, more work, more fame, more attention. And that emptiness never gets filled out. That's the addiction. That's the core wound, usually from childhood. The shaming, parental shaming, the early childhood adverse experiences, the development gets stuck, usually at around toddler stage, 2 or 3. And even though the body continues to grow, and the very charismatic toxic narcissist can develop all sorts of amazing articulation and frameworks and more seductive charisma, really what they're doing is trying to fill up that empty hole. They never got the parental attention. So they continue to reiterate that with more and more audience and influence to get the mother to love them. And so the addiction grows. There's never enough orgasms. There's never enough attention. There's never enough of anything. That is the core addiction. So there's libidinal demand. It's very high. Marcus said he's got stallion energy, although that could be medication that he's on. And that is termed eros. That emptiness that's covered up by sex drive is then termed eros and then reified, glorified as something sacred, as opposed to a very broken lower chakra system. So that's the toxic masculine. And the toxic feminine, there's a marriage in cults. In narcissist and codependent marriages, in cults where there's a guru and lots of female submissive energy, doesn't matter if it's men or women, doesn't matter if it's in a political system with one prime minister or president that is clearly psychopathic and sociopathic and malignantly narcissist, co-opting codependence in his circle whether it's male or female, who then have no boundaries. They capitulate, they become subservient, they lose their voice, they do whatever they're told to do. That is the toxic feminine. No boundaries. So it's a violation of boundaries by the male in any body, the toxic masculine, of the toxic female in any body who has no boundary ability to hold their own container. So it's a penetration of the hole that can never close. We can have that in a marriage. We can have that in a cultish organization. We can have that in a political system. So it's just a scale of that refusal to be contained, refusal of limits, the reifying of that masculine penetrative energy that is basically libidinal incontinence, that is then sacralized through language. And we'll look at language, the dog whistle words that are used, like we'll talk about that. And then the toxic feminine, who sits in rapt awe and devotion, actually just codependence, submissive, unhealthy submissive, with continually giving up boundaries in deep pain, unable to hold a boundary because it's always paying a price, and it's usually attachment. So the attachment is too strong, trauma bonding, and can't be released to find sovereignty. So there's a real umbilical cord between, and this is not healthy male and healthy female, which in New Age spiritualized language is the divine union, which is what most monogamists would love. We are talking about two shadows that find each other and start to multiply and self-justify and get into a dynamic, a feeding frenzy. And there's exhilaration, and there's libidinal excitement, and there's a huge price to pay, but that can get deferred through instant gratification. So we're going to look at that pattern a little bit. So first of all, let me just wrap that section up by saying, have a look just at the language that's used. There are dog whistle words, and it's always better. It's always hyperbole. It's always cutting edge. It's always deep. It's always profound. It's always, I am special. I am having a special experience because I am special, and the experience is so special. It's sacred and it's evolutionary. And I'm going to teach you about that because I'm going to conflate that limerence, libidinal limerence, and excitement, chemical excitement, as enlightenment, which it is not. So I'm not going to give a video speech today on what is enlightenment, but it's not. Limerence and libidinal excess and incontinence. So these people, you can tell as well, their speech, like they just talk. They just talk over. In fact, it was interesting in this particular conversation, the two people who just had what I would call libidinal incontinence showing up in the mouth, that they were fairly constrained because they know that's politically correct. There's a lot of masking going on. a ton of masking because they learn how to become politically correct and show up as healthy adults when they're not. So there's the language. You know, look at the language. It's always outrageous. It's always evolutionary. It's always special. That's really a sign of narcissism parading as enlightenment. So next, I'd just like to look at this model, the model that has been proposed. We're not looking at people so much as patterns and models. The radical, there's a trigger word, the dog whistle word, radical, because it's hyperbole, radical monogamy is apparently something new. So I want to just decode that. First of all, it's not new at all. It's very ancient. It's called polygyny, when a man has a first wife and then a girlfriend that becomes a second wife, and then another girlfriend that becomes third wife. That is an ancient, I come from, you can hear my accent. I used to come from South Africa. So that form of relationship is as old as the African culture, which is about the oldest. So polygamy is one man, multiple wives, actually called polygyny. If it's that version, you can also have one woman and multiple men, but that never happens in history. We understand why. It's the male territorialism and jealousy. So it's never equal. It's never equal. And let me tell you, it only ever blesses and benefits the man, who will then create a whole narrative about why that is justifiable and that everybody's benefiting, and that any pain and suffering is a lack of spiritual growth and immaturity. So that is one of, I just thinking about that conversation, that was the moment where I had a visceral nausea to witness two cult leaders, males, sit and observe a woman in clearly emotional distress, who had been married under one particular form of unity, which was a single man and woman in divine masculine and feminine, and then was literally betrayed and told she could leave with some support financially if she didn't like it. That was my reading of that situation. Those were the words that were used. And at some point was coerced as well into experimentation and looking for something extramarital, which by definition is not monogamy at that point. At that point, monogamy wasn't even in existence. So you can use all the words you like. Radical monogamy wasn't present, and it's not new. So this is just reframing an ancient, a throuple or more arrangement that is from the agrarian period of our human history, and really is brutal for the women. So first wife has usually all the power and takes it out on second wife. And second wife becomes the servant and has to do all the manual labor. And first wife, because she's lost husband's attention to second wife, gets compensated with a bit of status and the ability to tell second wife what to do. So there's a payoff. But first wife never gets over that. So there's an ancient story that any Christian is familiar with, or any Jewish person. And the reason I bring this up is it's Gafni's favorite story that he uses to justify polyamory. And it's from ancient biblical days, so thousands of years old. It's a desert people, and it's the story of Rachel, who is second wife, and Jacob and Leah, who were the monogamous couple. So I don't need to go into that story. It's a very, very sad story. Let me just say that Leah, first wife, never recovers from having second wife join the union. Leah spends the rest of her days yearning for her husband to see her in her beauty and in her being, and to just spend quality present time with her. And she gives him hundreds of children, and it's never enough. Jacob is only interested in second wife, the younger, more beautiful version. It's a tragic story, absolutely tragic, and I'm sure I've done it a bit of a disservice. There are so many ways you could decode that and justify it. So that was, in those biblical desert days, that throuple was justifiable, it was normal. So I'm not saying that it was out of the norm, that was the norm. It's a very ancient model. So Gafni draws upon that ancient model to justify any polyamorous activity that he promotes. So this new age model is really just a grift. We have actually evolved from agrarian days, and I find it interesting that older men in long traditional lineages that are extremely conservative are actually drawing on these radically conservative ideas to promote something that they pretend is cutting edge and novel. That's novelty is already, and justification of libidinal desires. But I'd like to just briefly touch into, so we've looked at toxic masculine, feminine, we've looked at narcissism and codependence, we've looked at the reframing of ancient marriage patterns with something new and exciting. Just because that's grift, to make anything new, it's part of the dog whistle language. It's not at all. It's a shadow form of self-justification. Basically, I'm not going to diagnose anybody, but in general, one could say for a sexual addiction or libidinal excess, leakage, there's no container there in the masculine. It's leaking energy. And I'd like to talk about that, about genuine Tantra, which teaches the opposite. This is a kind of self-justifying neo-Tantra that is spiritual gaslighting. So let's just look at another point now, the ages of the people involved, because as a therapist, I'm always curious as to the power dynamic that's going on. We have a young lady who is heading up towards 30. We have a woman, a mature woman, who's heading up towards 40. We have a man who's heading up to 50, who's in control of the younger women. And then they bring in a teacher who's heading up, I guess, towards 70. So we're looking, and that's just rough because I know they're just a year or two off all of those. So 30, 40, 50, and 70. So we have a 40-year age difference between, and I'm just doing this rough math, between the man advising the group and the young woman who's joined the community. 40 years. She's 30, he's 40 years older. So without any ageism, as a therapist, I would look at those dynamics. I would wonder if the heading towards 50 man is heading into his midlife crisis. I would look at his hormones. I would look at, is he taking any supplements that he is now uncontained even more because of medications he's taking, hormonal medications, testosterone. I would look at the older man's situation in life, maybe some looking back over his own life, justifying what he's done. And all teachers, by the way, this is a very interesting phenomenon. All teachers end up teaching what they needed to learn about most. So if somebody is suffering from, so I teach creativity and I'm an expressive arts therapist as well. So if I needed to understand that libidinal energy, which I have had to, the creative drive, which is actually sublimated sexual energy, but that's another video. Or if I had to look at my sexual libidinal drive, I would then form a curriculum around it to try and understand it. And if I was in the rabbinical tradition, I might proselytize everybody to justify the fact that I was excommunicated and defrocked and had my, my rabbinical credentials stripped. And so then I became a spin doctor with a philosophy degree who now does marital counseling to justify my own lifespan. So, I would look at lots of things, and I'm not their therapist. So one thing I won't be doing is making diagnoses, because that's unethical. I would not be saying, why might somebody be hearing voices? I would not be saying, why might somebody be showing personality disorder? I would not be saying things like, this person evidently has sexual addiction. I would not be diagnosing anybody in that situation unless they were my client, which they're not. What I would be diagnosing, and I will happily do that publicly, is the abuse of power, because it's everywhere. It's a pattern of young, innocent women, giggly girls who declare themselves publicly. So I don't feel like I'm violating anybody's privacy, because this video, this conversation was put online to be dissected. That was the point, inviting comments, inviting feedback, and the collective is giving them brilliant feedback. So all I'm doing is joining in that. I'm not violating anybody's privacy here. We have a young, nearly 30 woman who giggles in places, never asserts her own needs or identity, hasn't developed that strength yet in her to say, I have a boundary. I don't want to sleep alone at night. But I might want to have a baby, and I might have a future together that might look stable. We have a mature woman who has been absolutely violated and compromised and is weeping publicly in her vulnerability. And people sit sociopathically dissociated not comforting her. There's no empathic response to a woman in distress for their actions. There's no ownership and accountability that's on the public conversation. Maybe there is elsewhere. I wouldn't want to judge that. But if this is a teaching moment, that is something that was the biggest red flag for me in the whole 2 hours of saying, we're special, I'm special, this model is special, therefore it's special enough to put in the public domain as a teaching model. And we have a woman in distress. And at that point, I was physically nauseated. Nobody moved to help, to comfort, only to justify. And to say, you will need to do more of this in order to become enlightened. So conflating betrayal trauma, which it is, betrayal trauma is a thing, you can go Google it, it's got specific. Conflating that betrayal trauma and the death of her dream and the destruction of the marriage contract with development that will lead to enlightenment. That is the spiritual abuse that I would like to really point out. That is typical in cults, and why these polyamorous models only ever benefit unhealthy men who have no containment, no limits, no self-constraint, and who justify that as eros. It's not eros. That's suffering from I am never enough syndrome. I will never be full syndrome. And that will develop into process addictions, such as sex, work, and status, and into product addictions, such as psychedelics, or in some cases, food. So process and product addictions develop from this core wound. I am never enough. I will never have enough platform. I will never have enough fame. I know, for example, Gafni's dream is to have his books in every airport in the world, like Yuval Harari. So Yuval Harari is one of the people that he has siphoned off to get a platform. In that situation, he does an attack of Harari's own philosophy in order to get a response from somebody famous, and therefore leapfrog up into another platform. You know, bros platforming bros, that didn't come to anything, so now he's trying Marcus. So that's a repeat pattern, and that's what I'm more interested in. Iterations of behaviors, historically, just the same pattern repeating itself everywhere. And somebody incapable, anybody incapable of learning about that pattern and having some ability to observe themselves objectively and develop some self-awareness, develop some accountability. When I come across somebody who has a iterative pattern, which is basically to repeat something so they can't move forward. It's a defense mechanism. There's a Peter Pan pattern here of men who never grow up. They cannot be accountable. They cannot commit to one woman. They cannot contain their sexuality. They cannot protect and support their loved ones. They cannot keep their audience or their flock safe. from themselves. The damage that is done is phenomenal, and we would call that a Peter Pan. It's developmental blockage. You know, that man never matures. And that man never has an ability to see themselves in action or to be accountable for the suffering and betrayal that they cause in the field. And the reason I'm making this video is because I have firsthand accounts from women who have suffered, and there has been absolutely no accountability, only gaslighting. So I just want to say, I don't know Vylana. And the gentleman tried to preempt challenges that they would receive by saying Vylana is a grown-up, nobody needs to be rescued here, she's participating willingly. My question is, and I'm not saying this about Vylana, I'm saying anybody in this situation, because there's millions of women in this situation. Can somebody who is suffering from codependence, and there's a whole thing there we will get into, why codependence, what is that? But the capitulation of boundaries, constantly giving up their own identity, their own needs in order to keep the attachment. So authenticity is sacrificed constantly for attachment. And there might be a performative element to that authenticity, which I notice the whole group does. The whole group in that conversation performs authenticity, but they can't find it. So there's a lot of masking. And they know that performative authenticity and sex sells, it's a grift. So, and that helps the charismatic, seductive narcissist gain cult following, blah, blah, blah. The question being, can a codependent ever really give full consent? That is a big question, because this hinges around violation of boundaries. Narcissistic and codependent abuse in any scale, whether it's marriage, family, organization, or political structures like we have at the moment, there's a power dynamic that is not equal, and the toxic masculine in an unhealthy form violates boundaries constantly and takes no accountability, and the toxic feminine in any gendered body keeps doing conciliatory behavior, capitulation, folding the boundaries until there's nothing left of the self that can still perform, strengthen, authentic power, but it's performance at that point. So it's a boundary violation. If somebody's really codependent, are they giving consent to that constant violation? So there's a difference between innocence, which is a young person who's never encountered something like this before. And there'll be lots of people listening to these podcasts. Yeah, and those are the people I'm speaking to, the young, innocent, spiritual seekers looking for guidance, looking for mature people to role model a good marriage, a healthy relationship, spiritual development and growth. And what they're getting is projection and masking and personality disorder and unhealthy power dynamics, gift wrapped as enlightenment teachings and a new marriage dynamic that is not new, it's not enlightened, it's ancient, it's agrarian, and it's never been helpful to the women in that situation. It only supports masculine hierarchy. So that's a big question. And as a therapist, when I saw Vylana's tears and all of them parroting Gafni's slogans, which he repeats all the time. There's kind of a rabbinical rhythm to the way he transmits a lesson. It's soporific. It induces kind of capitulation because you go into your bliss state and the boundaries are down and the words get iterated over and over. And then I hear other people start saying them. At that point, I know that there has been mimetic, what we would call mimetic colonization of another person's soul. Language is important to listen to. So we listen to the dog whistle words. It's always hyperbolic. It's always the newest, the biggest, the best, the most profound, the deepest. That is the exaggeration of a grifter selling you an agenda. And then we listen to language patterns when people start repeating word salad, absolute hyperbolic word salad. Some of it's anchored in ancient texts, whatever, dusty Aramaic libraries. I noticed Oxford was dropped as a vanity point. The fact that Alana's a model was dropped as a vanity status point. So the male ego is sitting there creating false memes in order to colonize the young, open minds of others. As a teacher who is steeped in teacher-student relationship, it's an abomination to me. It's an abomination, and that's why I felt like I needed to come on here and make a video to speak about our dynamics. I have to say, I learned so much from the collective wisdom. This is so much bigger. This is not a character assassination that everybody's doing. This is not a smear campaign. We will be told it is. This is not a takedown of jealous people desiring certain lifestyle. This is a shift in collective consciousness. And what I'm impressed most about is people finding their voice. People have found the language to discuss abuse. We've had lovely videos by healthy men. I listened to one of them talking about saying, no, this is toxic masculine. And more than anything, we need healthy masculine to be spoken into. And there was a wonderful video articulating young men saying, no, we reject this bullshit. This is the old school. This is a paradigm distortion, and we're not buying it. And for young men to start really articulating what is the healthy masculine, it was beautifully articulated. We had the psychedelic community saying how this is abusive, that the God bomb deliberately violates boundaries. So we had all sorts of wonderful narrations that are not takedowns. They are healthy articulations of the new paradigm being born, and we have the words, we have the voices, we have the gender balance of the different perspectives, because this was about multiple perspectives. People with different specializations all saying the same thing. That is a cultural shift. So I just wanted to bring the therapeutic quasi-medical perspective. We had hundreds of other perspectives. We had podcasters, we had yoga teachers, we had all sorts of perspectives, all saying the same thing. So I defy Marcus or Gafni to say this was a personal vendetta from anybody. It's not. This is a watershed moment in new spirituality, where hundreds of people with their own bodily experiences all felt that nausea, that embodied boundary, which we won't be gaslit out of, that said no. No. And so I'd like to end briefly by saying some of the conflations that are very dangerous, and I want to point them out. New Age drifting gurus love to take the ancient teachings and distort them. One of them is, you're only becoming enlightened if you keep saying yes. Yes. That's the toxic masculine right there. Yes. For women, it's healthy to be saying no most of the time. So that's when the masculine reframes spiritual belief systems, it's from their perspective always. And we need way more, and what a beautiful collection of voices here, way more women from, maturity through to the crone, the wise maiden, the mature mother, through to the elder, teaching and supporting the other perspective, which is, in evolutionary biology, you can see that most masculine behavior is all about gaining access to the womb. That's how we developed as a species. So the man he's only really one if he's penetrated and gained access. And mostly we see anything goes in order to do that, to access the female uterus. And that might be to perform status, to corner resources, to develop power, to do physical feats of strength, all the lovely, healthy, masculine things that need to be done to support a family and to support a woman when she's vulnerable as she has her children. So the masculine has to serve the feminine in its healthy form. And when I see an inversion where the feminine is just serving the masculine ego, my uterus screams no. If you're going to be teaching healthy divine union, I need to see a different dynamic here. I don't want to see women in tears, capitulating their boundaries. The divine female gets to say no as often as she needs. And she will not be gaslit out of that with a distortion of teachings that benefit only men. Of course, they want to say, you're not enlightened unless you're saying yes to every new thing in your life. No. We get to say no to literally everything unless it serves us and our uterus and the next generation, especially the next generation. Yeah, so there was a lot going on in that conversation. I'm really glad it's happened. And I just want to take a brief look at my phone here and see if I forgot anything. Yeah, so just generally, I'm glad I covered some grandiosity. People thinking their orgasms are somehow cosmic in scale and can generate new teachings to enlighten mankind. That is reaching a narcissistic level of sociopathy, and then there's the grooming of the cult followers, because there's a lot of agreement given from granddad to dad to wife to child about you are special, you are pure. That is always a red flag to me, is people telling each other just how special they are. We are all unique and special, but when I start seeing performative superlatives, I call that love bombing and grooming, because when I see people do that, it's because they have their own agenda and they want you to capitulate. I didn't see a lot of objective witnessing. So when there's somebody that claims to be a therapist or a spiritual guide who can't see himself or the others, or even begin to discuss shadow, only sees the light, I just see spiritual bypassing. So it doesn't really impress me. There was a lot of conditional regard. So I just wanted to say, one of the breach of ethics for me was when somebody says, I am so proud of you for doing this. As a therapist, that's just like a massive red flag. That is conditional love as opposed to objective witnessing of your client. It was what we call transactional analysis, was the grandparent telling the parent and the child that they were good boys and girls. No therapist, no trained therapist would ever do that. That is putting your own agenda onto your client, and that is not supporting sovereignty. That is enabling. So, I mean, there were just so many. That's the problem with jumping from one discipline that gives you a PhD and then calling yourself a doctor, and then you're just a spin doctor because you're pretending to be a trained therapist, doing more damage than good. I'm just looking quickly through my phone here for the notes. Yeah, I would have really liked to have had more discussion on shadow. If somebody is not discussing shadow and then is renaming a very early model in our evolutionary history as the new human, yeah, it's just it's a false meme, put it that way. We spoke about moral injury. We spoke about the blind, leading the blind, you know, the performative authenticity. There's also lots of cognitive bias here. There's a reinforcement bubble. So a lot of affirming of each other's shadow as if it's each other's enlightenment. That's a very dangerous cognitive bias, a blindness, a self-confirming falsehood. You keep congratulating each other for your own blindness. And there's supposed to be a chain of wisdom from the elder through to the middle-aged folks to the younger, you know, and I just saw a distortion of parenthood here. That's not counseling, that's not therapy, that's abuse of power. I'd like to discuss therapeutic containers finally about safety. That is the number one ethical obligation any person who calls themselves a teacher or a therapist or a marital guide to hold safety. And when somebody breaks down in tears, and then the therapist makes a joke about it, as opposed to holding that space with any empathy, my apples rise. Nobody saw this really from the woman's perspective, Vylana's perspective, as she moves up towards 40 and her biological clock is perhaps ticking, and then there's going to be pressure now to to have a child in case Alana has a child first. And I just see potential first wife, second wife syndrome of competitiveness that will be encouraged. It was encouraged in that conversation. There was a splitting and a judgment of the younger woman's purity, the projection of the virgin and the more mature, impure witch woman. And Marc is saying, well, if Vi and I make it, there was so much manipulation going on, and that competitive dynamic will be set up. First wife, second wife syndrome. It's inevitable. So my heart goes out to Vylana and Alana, because I wish them all the best in their sisterhood. And there was some recognition of wounding, sisterhood wounding. Yeah, we'll see. It's up to them. It's their choice. Just scrolling through the phone here. I think I've mentioned everything. I've mentioned the Peter Pan energy. I've mentioned the dissociation from genuine betrayal trauma. That wasn't addressed at all. I saw in other wonderful videos that Marcus is basically being cuckolded and encouraging that. What kind of man does that? He encourages his wife to, betray their marriage contract. That wasn't in their initial agreement. So that's all fine if it's in an ethical, non-monogamous agreement. There is consent at that point. So I'd like to leave everybody with that question. Can there be consent? Genuine, authentic consent with this power dynamic, with a breach of contract, with the financial asymmetry, with the biological clock ticking and the understanding that that creates attachment trauma. If she leaves the marriage, can she do that with somebody else? Does she have time? There's a underlying ticking time bomb with her own timing of her ability to conceive. Yeah, so wife number 2 usually does replace wife number 1 in the man's affections, and that's the Peter Pan pattern. Is rather than grow through the inevitable midlife crisis, which is looming, the drop in testosterone, the aging out. Marcus was aging out of Alana's chosen age group. So rather than go through the midlife crisis, deal with actually growing up, actually considering aging, vulnerability, and eventually death. The Peter Pan goes back to beginning and starts off with another young one, that he can keep kidding himself that he's eternal, he's always virile, and that he doesn't have to grow up and become comfortable or develop true intimacy. This is an intimacy disorder. I see it in, it's being taught. The primary problem of intimacy disorder, which also has other names attached to it that I'm not going to mention, that's a diagnosis. But intimacy disorder in this arena is being developed and reframed into a curriculum to deliberately not have to develop intimacy, because you just keep seeking novelty and horizontal titillation as opposed to true depth and true intimacy. Add on to that midlife crisis, ticking time bombs in uterus. Somebody who's lost and can't find a career direction and is probably just enjoying having a great pastime and being spoiled and looked after, and diversion of attention until she knows what she wants in life. And somebody desperately seeking to expand their platform as the main agenda, using everybody around them in order to get what they need, which is to be in every airport across the world, like their nemesis, Yuval Harari. So I think I'm done here for today. If you enjoyed this analysis, you can find me on my YouTube channel. You can find me on other YouTubes all over the place. I usually talk about polarity as one of the things that I'm a psychoeducator and therapist. That's one of the things I look at, the phenomenology of creativity, which is basically taking that sexual energy and elevating it through the chakras until it actually is rising consciousness and mystical union. So there's lots more coming from me on that. There's a book coming out called Integral Taoism, Polarity and Sex, Creativity, Power and Emergence. That's going to be out in a couple of months. Yeah, so thank you very much, really, for participating in this watershed moment in the spiritual community, for finding the articulation, the words, the perspective. Each one is unique and absolutely true. We put all these true but partial perspectives together, we can see it. We can see it. And we're saying no. So I just want to say I see the young innocent students. I see the crying women. I see the lost men desperately seeking for healthy male role models and avoiding the toxic radicalization online right now of young men. We need healthy masculine and feminine teachers. So here we are as a group. Thank you, everybody, for putting a video together and taking the time. This needed to be called out. And just to say one more time, this is not a personal attack. It's not a character assassination. It's not a smear campaign. It's the emergence of the new paradigm through our consciousness and our collective wisdom. And we are no longer going to put anybody on a pedestal that is toxically reframing agendas to suit their libidinal excess. So thank you very much, everybody. Find me somewhere. I'm certainly finding you guys, and we'll be following some of you too. So take care.